Greetings and salutations, all you beautiful people, and welcome to another episode of Art of the Beholder, a show dedicated to all things eclectic in the world of art, where we do deep dives into deep cuts and help you understand why damn things matter. I'm your host, Novo Day, and today we're going to be talking about art in history, focusing on the poetry and literary writings of the Beat generation. To hash it out, we are once again joined by our favorite poet, Miss Alexandra Parsons of alexandraparsons.com. Welcome back.
Oh, I'm so excited about this.
I know
Thank
it's
you.
it's been brewing. We've been talking about this for a while, and you
Mhm.
being a I'm not even sure if our audience knows that you are quite the poet. I don't think we talk about it enough.
Yeah, I always surprise myself with my strange things that I keep secret from people. I don't even know if I'm conscious of it.
It's out in the open now. Now
Yeah.
now the world knows.
It's been a goal of mine to be more open, and every year I'm always like I'm going to go do poetry reading, and I used to do them as kids when I was a kid. My mom used to have me go on stage at school, and I won a couple awards. And then I just kept writing and writing, and I used to have tons and tons of books of poetry. I still have a lot, but there was like a weird fire that happened. So
Mm.
some stuff was traveling from New York to LA, and I lost a lot of it.
Your own
But
personal poetry?
a lot of personal all my journals since I was little. Yeah, I lost that. Yeah, it's nuts. Like a lot of personal stuff was just gone. But you can't take that shit with you when you die,
That's true. That's true.
as John
And
Lennon says. So
we have the next best thing, the modern platform to talk about these things and give the world our own poetry and things like that is the podcast. So we get to do a little bit today because we want to talk about this subject. One, because it has been, I think, an incredible inspiration to you as a writer.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I realized, man, you know what's crazy is the more I dug into this history and this period and these people and these artists and all these things I love to just sink my teeth into, I realized that this is another perfect art history subject for our show because it overlaps with so many of our three-part series on art history. Like
Mhm.
these guys are rubbing shoulders and elbows with abstract expressionists and all this stuff and helped change the game forever. And I was like, oh man, this was another one of those moments of destiny where I was like, oh well, this fits perfect into the progeny of our shows and what we like to talk about and how things have shaped us and how culture shapes art and art shapes culture. So let's tell the good people why. Why are we talking about the Beat generation or era today? Because it's not only a milestone in the history of poetry and literary writing, but forever changed the game, as I already said, revolutionizing concepts in both style and shape, as well as the very concept of what poetry could be, and most importantly, what could be in it. So essentially, these artists not only rewrote the rules, they burned the whole goddamn playbook and forever changed the game for us. The floodgates opened. We were just like I already talked about abstract expressionists, just like them changing the game and breaking down the walls for allowing future generations like us to create whatever we wanted. They did the same thing with poetry and literary writing, and here we are.
Yeah, yeah, they created a lot of uproar
Yeah.
within the literary form of as we'll discover there was a lot of like a lot of them got bans,
Oh
and
god, poor Ginsberg.
yeah,
Like,
a lot Williams, Burroughs, and Ginsberg both got banned and were sent to court, right, for some of
yeah.
their obscene writing, which was against a lot of what the amendment, like freedom of speech. And so it definitely pushed the boundaries of like this is my right to speak from my heart. Yeah, and it's everything. Yeah, they lived an artist's life, this group, they truly did.
But they would talk. What's crazy is how honest they were, how profound in their writing of telling the world about their addictions and their hardships
Oh
and
my
their
god, yes.
struggles. And we'll get to that in a minute. Before we do, of course, we all need a little background. So, starting in New York City in the 1940s and evolving in San Francisco in the 1950s, beat poetry was a part of, as already stated, the Beat generation, which is the focus today, which was a literary subculture that focused on the rejection of standard narrative values, the rejection of economic materialism, explicit portrayals of the human condition, experimentation with psychedelic drugs, and sex liberation and exploration. Often called beat poets, you may know them from a different name in popular culture, and that is the beatnik, though they honestly, from the research I did, they kind of hated this term. And so a lot of them kind of viewed it critically by a lot of the major authors in the movement. The word beat itself was initially used in the context of being beaten down, though through time it included the imagery of concepts that were upbeat as well as even musical, like the beat of music. So there is a lot to discuss today, but we're going to take a little break. We'll be right back, guys. This episode is brought to you by Novella Adulteration. Follow adult entertainer Jessica Amberstar as she embarks on a journey that will change her life forever. She not only finds herself in the industry, but figures out a way to transform herself and eventually become reborn. Find out how in Adulteration, which can be found on Amazon in both paperback and ebook. Available now. Now back to the show. All right, Ms. Parsons, we are back, and I want to start here. You know, as we like to do on our show, we focus on the artists and, most importantly, their work. And so I want to focus on poet and poetry first. And I want to start with the core group of the generation, and its kind of unofficial leader, even though he fucking hated this, which is Allen Ginsberg. I want to start with him because even if people don't know this history or only took, fucking art history 101, most people know either the name Ginsberg or Ginsbergian poetry. Most people know Allen Ginsberg, even if you've never even read some of his poetry. So I feel like this is a good common denominator to then spread our wings into a lot of the other poets from this generation and kind of go into a conclusion section. So we're going to start with Allen Ginsberg, and that's actually where I started. I started when I was researching this subject and piece. I started with 1956 Howl.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And Howl is where to begin. Howl is it's separated into three acts, and I will just probably tee up the conversation by Howl Act One. To me, when I read it for the first time, I was like, this is everything. This is life. This is, from the most beautiful things to the darkest things. And I like this three act structure poem. It's long form, it's kind of epic in nature. And what I learned right away was instead of classical poetry, there's he would use one word to often tie a lot of his pieces together, but it was more novel like to me in nature and narrative, like stream of consciousness.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, stream of consciousness.
It was everything. It was both intellectual, but as we already hinted at, he was not shy to be a little lewd, a little crude, a little blunt, and a lot of hot water for this, especially when it comes to sexuality or sexually explicit imagery.
Yeah, when you tell somebody like fucked in the ass or something, there's a part in the
He'll say cocksucker. He'll say, he's throwing his world, his life into your face hard, like punk rock hard.
I think the best way, if you have never listened to Howl or read it yourself, the best way I think is to listen to Allen Ginsberg read it. I think that's the best way at first, because then I think I read it first, and then I went and listened to him recite it by like looking it up on YouTube and stuff, and I've watched documentaries. But
Like when you read it, obviously you have a way, like any reader is going to read it with their own cadence and things like that. But like how he does it is probably a little more musical, if I had
and
to guess.
once you hear him, like I think once you hear him like recite it and then you read it, you can hear I hear him. Then I hear his voice. Like I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. The way, but his voice tone, it's so nostalgic for me. Um, he has this rhythm, that beat rhythm. I mean, I can't even it's hard to even describe, like when you're trying to describe someone's tone. You're like, it's beautiful, and it's dark, and it's just this point where you're sitting there, and I can like imagine, like I could hear all the sounds of New York.
Mm,
It's very like
it's visceral.
very visceral. Exactly. And he speaks for all the generations. Like this is not just a stuck in time. Him, it's universal. He's speaking for like this the mind of the psyche, and what we go through, not just on the streets of everyday life, but also in our own mind and the streets of our like our narrow passageways that we go through every day. So that's why this poem is really really beautiful. It's just it is stream of consciousness, but there's like a madness to it, right? There's like a rhythm to the madness.
Absolutely. I actually am glad you used the word psyche because when I was trying to, for all the people out there listening right now that has never heard of Howl or read Howl, it's, it being divided into three acts, I was trying to think of the best metaphor or simile to describe it to an audience. And the psyche is really perfect. I actually likened it to the the id, ego, and super ego of
Mm. Yeah.
poetry writing. Whereas, but it's not balanced that way. It doesn't go from the bottom up or from the top down. It just like life, it goes in a very random order. So act one to me is very ego. It's very grounded. And
Mhm.
then and act two, when he's talking about Moloch and stuff, it's very otherworldly, nightmarish. That's like the super ego. That's like, the world beyond us kind of thing. And then the last act is very very primal and raw and hard.
The one where he goes, "Carl Solomon, I'm with you in
Yeah,
Rockland." I love it. Just changes, and all of a sudden you're like, "Am I in a different poem? Like what?"
different world again.
The rhythm, "I'm with you in Rockland, where you must." I can't even give it justice when I say it, because like I just the way his accent, like his little New York, his like New York Jewish accent is so adorable. I mean, I kind of just like in love. If I met Ginsberg and I was his age at that time, I would have had such a major crush on him. Even though he was like, I wasn't his type. He was gay, but
Sure.
like I would have been like, can I please just like be your like platonic wife?
Hang out and go to
Just
dinner and drink wine
I would have
together.
been a
And
fangirl. I would have just
yeah,
so adorable. I'm like, I think these poems, like, and this group really, like, I've always was in love with New York since I was a kid because my parents are from there and going there every year, every summer. And then I was like, the way I discovered them, if you don't mind me telling you how I discovered
please
um these poets, it was just like
go on a little tangent corner.
yeah, just kinda like I was really into, as of course every college kid, into Bob Dylan,
Sure.
and I was
And
really
they ran
getting
in the same circles. I found that fascinating as well. It's like, God damn, it's like it's
Dylan
adding up
got
again.
a lot of his inspiration from,
Ginsburg Price.
Ginsberg, and that was, like, his really big muse, so I was very much, like, was watching a documentary, and, then I was like I watched, I think it was that one film that Kate Winslet and all these different actors played Dylan. Do you remember that one? I forgot that movie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then, I was like, "Who's that man with Bob Dylan?" And they was talking about Allen Ginsberg. I'm like, I was, like, just immediately fixated. I was like, "Wait, who's" I was like, "Oh, I've heard of this poem." I was like, "Oh, that's Ginsberg?" And then I was
Do
like,
you
"Oh,
have a favorite Ginsberg poem then? Or is it hard to pick?
um, ugh." No,
Is
I
there
think
one
that
that you feel like, sometimes I have, it's not a poem, it's a book, but I feel like I have something that changed my life literally forever. Do you feel like you have anything like that in the poetry world?
a poem just in general, like, or does it
Poem
have
just
to
in
be
general?
Ginsberg? Is
Yeah,
this
it could be a poem just in general, but I mean, I would like to hear your favorite Ginsberg poem though. But if it is something besides Ginsberg, I'll allow it.
no, 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 that's fine. Jesus Christ, that's hard because
So many.
all of
What's the
them are
first
s
thing?
I
What's the
love
first thing
them.
that
I
pops in your head
kinda
then?
America,
America. Okay, there you go.
which is not it's not on your list, and I don't think a lot of people say that, but just, like, 'cause it's been a while since I've read that one, but, I just every time like, hear him, recite or I read some of his stuff, I always can just hear the America, poem by Ginsberg.
No, that
Now I'm looking
very
it up.
fitting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I only put, a few of the ones I knew I was gonna probably direct my attention to, but there, as we've talked many a times on these discussion sections, there's no rules. So, like, yeah, if you want to dive into America or any of his other works, please do so.
I'm looking for the poem, so, like, I was like, I don't know what I mean, it's been a while since I've read it, so I'm like, "Where is it?" So I can, like, remember because I've been soaking up so much of, like, William Burroughs and remembering
Sure,
because
a little of everything
yeah,
else.
I read Junkie and Naked Lunch a long time ago, and then I was just been, I never actually read any of Jack Kerouac's books.
Mm.
I kinda refuse to. 'Cause
Before
all of my, like, pretentious friends, college friends, and, like, high school friends were like, "Oh my Jack Kerouac is everything," and I'm like, "God, it's fucking
Before
annoying."
we get there, though, put a pin in that because the reason I put Howl, down and the other major writing of Ginsberg, which is Kaddish in 1959, is because I feel like those kind of are, bookends to a lot of his work. They're like kind of his epic masterpieces.
It is, and there's, like, a movie done on Howl. There's, like, a
Yeah,
lot of, like, didn't
like 10
who
years ago, they did it. I think the movie's just called Howl,
yeah, what's his name?
and
Frank what's his the fucking guy's name?
Frank Darabont.
No, the actor who played him.
Oh, I don't remember off the top of my head. But what did you I actually what's crazy is so I started with Howl, 1956. That was the very first poem I read for this piece, and the very last poem I read for this piece was Kaddish just this morning,
Mhm, me yeah, Kaddish was
1959.
yesterday, I re-listened to it.
And this is if you don't know, so this is about his late mother.
Mhm.
And it's written in 5 acts, and it essentially chronicles her life, as she is dying, on the road to death, and then eventually her passing, her death, and then the aftermath of that death. And again, it's very, it's apples and oranges to Hal. It's very much a Ginsberg poem. You can see his style and shapes in there, all of his figures and how he would like to write poetry, but it's a completely different narrative beast, and I already likened his work to novel writing or short story writing or even probably the novella to a lesser
Mhm.
extent. And you really see this arc, this journey that you go um uh, with the narrator, which is obviously Allen Ginsberg himself. And it is I don't get very emotional with poetry or reading a book or things like that, but it really hit me kind of
It
hard. I
hit
actually start
you?
Yeah, when we actually got to the death of his mother, I actually was tearing up a little bit. And
Is your mom still alive?
my mom is still alive.
Okay, but
Yes.
it triggers that. It makes you think of, like,
I'm my mom's only son, and so
"Oh,
I
that's so
do have
sweet."
a very close relationship with my mom. She's probably listening to this right now. And yeah, I mean, like I've said in other shows, I mean, like I wouldn't even be here. I mean, not only in the literal sense, but like
Mhm.
figuratively, I wouldn't, I wouldn't be, as artistic, as intellectual. Like I feel like I owe a huge debt to everything I became and who I am to my mother. So I totally get it. I totally
Mhm.
get Ginsberg's relationship with his mother and how it was so profound and powerful, and her death was life changing for him. And he had to write about it. He had to put it into a poem, and it became another epic, long form piece of his.
Yeah.
And it was spellbinding.
It is spellbinding. When you asked me, I was like my brain went to America, but, like, I just listened to Kaddish again. I read it a lot while multiple times a long time ago, and then, listening to it in the car, I'm just like I was so dramatic. I was like, "Oh, yes." I was, like, snapping my fingers. I was like
Oh, this little beatnik over here,
I
guys.
know, my dad always
She's got her
laughs. He's like,
beret on.
I that's really funny that you say that. My one Christmas, my sister got me all of Ginsberg's greatest, right, all of his writing, and then I also got a beret from my mom that same Christmas, so I was, like, so excited to get this big, huge Ginsberg book, and my dad's like, "What the" his words were like, "What the fuck? I didn't know you were gonna grow up to be a goddamn, beatnik." He's like, I didn't like those people. I used to walk down Greenwich Village and be like, oh, who are these weirdos? I was like, oh my God.
What's even funnier is I feel like our generation, our understanding of the beatnik is like the cartoonish caricature, like we would see in comedy movies of like, yeah, this pretentious, like snapping their fingers instead of clapping.
Hmm.
And I always think of the movie. Do you remember the movie How I Married an Axe Murderer
Oh
or something like
yeah. Oh,
that
I do. Yeah.
with Mike Myers, and he was a
Hmm.
beat poet.
Oh, I
And
forgot
I
about
remember,
that.
yeah, I remember being a kid and being like, "Is this what poetry is?" I actually have one before we move on because we got to talk about the rest of the core group of the generation, which consisted of Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, Herbert Huncke, and Lucian Carr. I want to dive into the Holy Trinity, which is Ginsberg, Kerouac, and Burroughs.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a quick story. My oldest memory as a little boy, my oldest memory of a profession I wanted to choose, I remember telling my mom I wanted to be a poet.
Really?
Yep, as a
Well, that
little
makes
boy.
sense. You're a writer.
Yeah,
So,
it kinda, yeah, I was thinking of, like, how I got here, and I was like, "Oh, man, I guess this is destiny in a way," that
I
I
love
ended up going
that.
into writing, and I do write. I don't think I don't think I've ever told you this. I have written poetry myself that I've
Hmm.
never shared with anyone because I knew I would want to turn that into a like music. So I've written a lot of songs, and those
Hmm.
songs first start as poems.
Hmm.
So there is a little backlog of poetry that Novo
No,
Day
you didn't
has.
tell me that.
That's in the vault somewhere. Oh, I know where it is.
I think there's a romanticism on keeping certain things like a secret for yourself. We like run.
Yes, this one was so like I've always prided myself, and I urge everyone. Here's our PSA. We have one every episode. Is when there's life is life, life happens, and when terrible things happen, I always recommend to, especially if you're an artist, to channel that into your art. And I had probably actually before I met my wife one of the worst breakups I've ever had in my life, and I don't know what. I mean, I know that it was that was the muse, but I couldn't stop writing. Like I was writing and writing and writing, and they were all these poems that I wanted to eventually turn into songs.
Hmm.
And so I have this huge backlog of poems that I probably need to revisit one of these days. Maybe I'll put it out for you guys one of these days. But before we do that, yeah, one of these days maybe I'll do that. We gotta tell the good people about the next person on our list, which is Jack Kerouac. Now I want to tee up the conversation with let's first tell the good people his work. So he was both a novelist and a poet. His novels include On the Road in 1957, The Dharma Bums, Big Sur, and Desolation Angels. His poems are a collection of poetry, like collections works. Was Scattered Poems from 1971, Mexico City Blues in 1959, Book of Haikus, and Old Angel Midnight. And there's a lot of debate, and Miss Parsons kind of hinted at this.
Hmm.
There was a little foreshadowing because a lot of people, Ginsburg didn't want to be the unofficial leader of the Beat Generation. It just happens. This happens with art history and people. We're human. We have to categorize fucking everything, right?
Hmm.
And he just kind of became it. Now, a lot of people that really dig into the history of this stuff, I found people would argue and say, no, Jack Kerouac is the guy. He's the GOAT. He's the best.
Yeah.
And I didn't really, as much as I respected his work and appreciate his work, just like a lot of artists, I didn't fall in love with his work though. I didn't gravitate towards it. I
Same.
didn't
Yeah.
personally feel like he was the GOAT.
Yeah. I agree. I've never read. I mean, I've read the Cliff Notes. I know the stories of his books. I've read some of his poems, and I've heard him like I've listened to some of his readings, but I never was gravitated to him. He's very beautiful. He was like a handsome man.
Crazy
I think he
handsome.
was like
Yeah.
the only one of the only straight men in the group, but he and all of them were kind of in love with him in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they all looked at him like this optimistic, iconic man because as they were more like so a lot of their other poems as far as Burroughs and Ginsberg and like Lawrence Ferletti and them. They were more like in the darker streets, a little more cynical, right?
Right.
And Ginsberg, he had more an optimism about quote unquote the Beat Generation,
Right.
and they looked up to him. They were like almost like they like even in their poems, and if you listen to the way they talk about him, they like adored him. Because I
And he
think
became kind of a celebrity within the culture,
he
you know?
did, and I think it's just because he was so handsome. He was that classic strong, sexy, single man, mysterious poet. He was a great. He read really well. Like when you listen to him reading, there was you can kind
Like
of
a
tell
confidence about him and
there was
this
a sexiness, a confidence about him.
he was a performer more than he was just a writer
Him
kind of
and
thing.
Ginsberg sounded a little alike, but you could tell it's Kerouac with like his like Massachusetts Boston accent.
Mm.
You're like that, like it's like some of his poems talk. He sounds like
Hakika,
that. Yeah, I was like, where is he from again? I'm like, oh yeah,
Hakika,
Massachusetts.
Harvard Yard.
But he did speak a lot of that very rebellion, free spirited, that mind where you're exploring that curiosity as like a high schooler, a teenager. Those
So it
years,
makes sense why people gravitated towards him
yeah,
then, you
yeah.
know? Because I
It's
bet a lot of people felt I mean, like, every generation feels that way, and then when you have some artist or someone you can be like, "Oh, man, he is speaking about
mhm.
me. He's speaking for us even," then I can see how these people get put on pedestals.
Because he wrote from his experiences, and it was so funny. He constantly was like changing the names, but clearly, Jack
Oh,
Kerouac
yeah.
was this character in his book, and Ginsberg was this character,
Burroughs
and
was in there. Oh, yeah.
Burroughs. Yeah, I love William Burroughs, but we'll get into that shortly. But all of them spoke a truth
Yeah,
and a wavelength that was very much their reality because they
absolutely.
had to. It's just like any artist or poet, like you have to be truthful. Or my sister says this a lot, like Marie, and something that really resonated to me. And I was saying we're talking about acting and writing, and I was like, well, I don't think blah 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 is a great actor, and she was like, well, that's because that person isn't even truthful to themselves, and acting is all about truth.
Right.
And she's like, and so is like writing and everything and being an artist. If you can't be truthful to yourself, then you're not going to be a great artist in a lot of different levels. So they were just completely always so truthful. And I think that's why it resonated with people during a time where truth was kind of scary,
Mhm.
right? So,
Oh yeah, I mean they like we already talked about earlier in the show, they were they were getting arrested for
mhm.
writing obscene things, not doing any obscene things, writing about it. And, talk about a different time, thinking that that would happen today, it would be mind-boggling
Mhm.
especially with the media we have today and what's allowed today, would just make their minds explode that they were getting in trouble for these very minor things in retrospect.
Yeah.
So I have to ask them to transition. Why do you love William S. Burroughs?
I was thinking about that a lot last night, and he's hilarious. He's dark. I think as I love dark humor,
I got to know him in the podcast you sent me, so tell the good people about that.
well, he's just like him and Ginsberg were clearly both queer, both really good friends. I think they hung out the most together. I personally love Burroughs because of his again, his honesty and how he took his addiction. There was like one poem where he talks about addiction, but how we're all addicted to everything, addicted to TV, addicted to this. But he talks about addiction as an individual, like, no, like
Mm.
not the person. I am addiction.
And that's why he was talking about 1953's his novel Junkie
Yeah.
in conjunction to how we are junkies to so many things besides
Yes, that was in
just
that. Yeah, yeah.
just
Thank you.
the just, more of the superficial things like drug abuse,
Mm-hmm.
addiction, or alcohol addiction, or things like that. I think the most profound thing to me in that conversation was his ideas about that we're addicted and that we are junkies to information.
Yes. Like we're all at fault for being, yeah, junkies. And that God, that book, it's not a very big book. None of his book writings are very big. I don't think they're not thick enough.
Long, you mean,
Yeah, they're not
in
thick,
format?
but they're just profound and honest and very raw and dark. And um, yeah, I just love that he speaks to you and connects things that I love when people connect the dots. And I think human beings in general were pretty good at it, but he was exceptionally
Yeah,
good
good
at
at it.
that. Yeah, and that resonated with me really well in that. And I just love how they like riffed off each other in that interview, and hearing their voice, hearing them just kind of like talk. Like, you don't really hear that anymore, right? Like the way they were talking with each other. You're like,
Oh yeah,
they were
the
very
actual
distracted too. You're like, I'm like, wait, are you gonna read a poem or like what's going? At one
the
point, I'm like, what's
cadence
going
and the
on?
accent, was a bit of a time capsule as well. Just like if someone's listening to this 50
Hmm.
years from now, 100 years from now, they're gonna be like, Jesus Christ, those Americans used to talk that way.
It was humbling. But did you feel like when you were listening to it that I'm like, are you guys reading a poem now, or are you just talking? Like there was a good. I
Yeah,
got
it was
lost
it
in it
was
a couple
their
times.
conversation itself was stream of consciousness. Like they would
Yeah.
definitely bounce around to different subjects and subject matter. And I mean, we finally got definitely he finally read some excerpts from his 1959 novel Naked Lunch,
Yeah.
which talking about. I'm glad you said connect the dots
Hmm.
because much like I hinted at in our intro, how it was destiny to talk about this part of art history because Naked Lunch has a steam powered dildo in the story named Steely Dan.
Oh my
That's where
god.
the musicians Steely Dan got the
I
name
forgot about
from
that.
that book. Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs. He also went on to write the Nova trilogy, 1961 and 1964, Cities of the Red Night in 1981, and The Place of Dead Road in 1983. His poems consist of cut up poems from Minutes to Go, 1960, Dead Whistle Stop Already, End, 1962, Spain and 42nd Street, Where Flesh Circulates, 1962, Cold Lost Marbles, 1972, and Fear and the Monkey.
Never really read a lot of his poems. I read Junkie. I listened. I was listening to
You're reading
them.
more of the novels.
I read
Okay.
the long time, like in high school or whatever. I read Junkie. I don't know if I ever finished Naked Lunch. All of his stuff is usually about. It's all about like drugs, heroin user.
Well, he was a heroin user.
He was a
He was a drug
he
addict,
was
a hard drug addict. So
yeah, big time. And he just wrote about his demons, and I think he felt like
exactly,
he needed to write about it. I
exactly.
think that's why he survived for as long as he did. He had this artistic form that he was able to release. And he was addicted. I think he was addicted to the drugs because it was also his way of creating this art. Like a lot of artists who get addicted to things like, I can't create my art unless I have this drug. This is what helps me become my artist that I am.
Studies just came out recently that say marijuana, a lot of hallucinogenic drugs aren't don't really help in that department. A
Oh,
lot of that was
interesting.
yeah, that it was a lot of delusion over the years. I think because people would say that so much, they just believed it. They're like, "Oh, well, I feel so inspired. It's just opening my mind." And there's like psychological studies being conducted right now and have been in the last few years that are really try to truly answer that objectively. Like, is this making us more inspirational, smarter, more, creative? And the short answer is no. That's really not.
That's really fun because this whole group believes that very much helped them. That they got experimented in LSD and different
I think,
drugs.
I think yes, drugs is going to definitely change your mind. I feel like probably the experience itself, like the aftermath, like when you actually get sober and you come out of it and you're like, "Whoa, that was a life-changing, life-altering event in my life." I bet like that stuff is more inspirational and helping to fuel the creativity than purely I guess what the researchers were trying to understand in my example is like, is it truly the drugs itself or the experience of the drugs? And they were first trying to just answer the first one. Is it the drugs themselves that are making people more creative? Because they sure have been saying it for a long time. And yeah, the short answer is no. But I
Okay, that
think
makes sense. Okay.
yeah, I think that that has to be the experience of just like when you go travel, when you experience something profound in your life, you're traveling to a culture you've never experienced in your life. that's going to change you. To round out the group, we also have Herbert Huncke and Lucian Carr. Huncke wrote things that include Huncke's Journal of Poems, The
Yeah.
Evening Sun Turned Crimson, Guilty of Everything, Again, The Hospital, and From Dream to Dream. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time
On
on
him,
Huncke
yeah.
and Carr.
I wasn't the biggest fan of. He was a cranky little old man.
I think it's important to like understand that these five men were such an artistic collective, a troupe that helped, almost like a band writes music. They were like a band of brothers to help each other write poems and books. And I felt like that is important, an important part of the history, that such a unit, a collective, a brotherhood, that they would inspire each other, and then not always through the best means, kind of like in the vein of the heroin addiction stuff. They would not always be the best influences on each other, but an influence nonetheless. They would definitely help push each other to create new and provocative and innovative things, and I felt like that was an important piece of the history.
Yeah. Herbert Honke is I think they definitely used a lot of Kerouac used him and other people used him as like because he was such a character, because he was like a hobo. That's the word that Wikipedia referred
Hobo.
him to, as hobo.
Wikipedia said hobo?
Wikipedia
No
referred him
shit.
that he left
Hobo's
Chicago
such
as a
like a
teenager,
colloquialism too, They
living
didn't
as a
say person in poverty or homeless person.
yeah, they,
He's a hobo.
they said living
Oh
as a
fuck.
hobo
Come
jumping
on,
trains.
Wikipedia, lock your shit up,
That's what
God. That's why we don't
that's
have nice things.
I'm
Jesus
laughing.
Christ.
It's
But yeah, that rounded out the troop. And but this was not, I think what's important for people to understand was, as much as this was a lot of driving force of this generation, this history, this era, to create new and innovative things in this
mhm.
form, these weren't the only ones. So we need
No.
to give a little love to the other poets that are considered part of the Beat generation. So I'm going to go through them really quick, so bear with me. Jack Gilbert, Eddie Parker, Leonard Cohen. We did a show on him already. The musician. Click here. Joyce Johnson, Robert Bob Kaufman, Carolyn Cassidy, Gregory Corso. Really liked his work. Hetty Jones, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Joanne Kiger, Richard Brodigan, Harriet Somers Swirling. That's quite a name. Michael McClure, Diane DePrima, Jack Hirschman, Bonnie Bremser, Kenneth Patchen, Ruth Wise, Lou Welch, Kenneth Roxroth, Gary Snyder, and Philip Wallen. And there's probably more. So if you guys have any additional authors, writers, poets you'd like us to acknowledge, please put it in the comments. But of all the other writers besides the core group that I have to say I really fell in love with when I was reading
Mhm.
so many poems in the last 2 weeks, was honestly Diane DePrima.
I
I,
was
I
gonna mention
really
her.
loved
Yeah.
her work.
I
Jesus Christ, she was good.
She has some beautiful, I mean, I can't think of them off the bat. She had some beautiful, beautiful poems. She really lived in that moment. A lot it's unfortunate that a lot of the men got, of course, the most of the attention.
Well, that is, I mean, I wanted to definitely bring in the ladies because that is an unfortunate reality of all of history. Not only not only art history, but the men get the spotlight and the women are pushed into the shadows, when there was a lot of amazing female writers at this
Yes.
time. So that's why
Yeah.
we wanted to give them equal time with the honorary, honorable mentions.
Mhm.
But I mean, when I've in our other shows, we would have to go out of our way to really try to find the history of how the women influenced a lot of the art, whatever it may be, with surrealism or avant-garde or what have you. So
Yeah.
there was always a lot, but it's just a shame that historically do not get the recognition they so deserve.
Yeah, I think we forgot to mention Neil Cassidy too. He was a big like part of that kind of like figure in the Beat generation during the psychedelic culture. He was, I think it says he was prominently featured as himself in the scroll of the version of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So
Hmm.
I don't know if he how many. But I think he got, he went to jail a couple times, but he was just a really big figure and inspiration for that group. And
Yeah.
I think I don't know if he visited and went to Columbia, but a lot of them also, like Allen Ginsberg went to Columbia. I think Jack Kerouac, a lot of them went to Columbia.
Burroughs went to Harvard. I remember him saying.
Burroughs went to, of course. So yeah, you can tell when you hear these men talking that they're such intellectuals. They're such like just so fucking smart. But yeah, so just he was like a
They're
big
wicked smart.
they're
Sorry.
wicked smart, but I don't
Oh, wicked smart.
he like helped Cassie. I don't think he wrote a lot of books. I'm looking to see if he wrote anything. He did write some stuff, but he was more like I hung out with them and he inspired them, and they talk about him in his poems. Like, and now like Allen Ginsberg did it with Solomon, who I think he was in love with Solomon, and he dedicated I think he dedicated Howl to Solomon.
He was a soldier. I wanna say in the history, Solomon was a soldier. I don't remember.
Yeah, because he said it says Howell and it says for Carlos Solomon. I have to look that up. I forgot. But anyway, they were all like in love with each other in a
They're all in love with
sweet,
each other.
very sweet. They worked off
Sweet,
each other. But
enduring way.
you see that in so many generations. Like you see that also in the 20s when everybody was like all the writers and artists were hanging out in the 1920s and
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. The generations that came before them, we would see these collectives, these groups that would, yeah, fall in love with each other, find muses in each other,
do we
and
still
help
have
to
that?
inspire.
Like it's kind of like do we
W
still have
we're
that? We're just
Allie, we're doing it right now. We're a community, you
oh,
know?
okay, that's
Yeah.
nice. It's just like think of like TikTok. It's so I get worried about our generation, but that's pretty normal with all the TikTok and being
Yeah, no, I think that's human nature. I think artists and like-minded people are always gonna find each other and help to create. It's just the playing field has changed. You
yeah.
know, we're not meeting in coffee shops and going to each other's houses to, write music, or books or poems or whatever together. We're doing it remotely, We're talking about it on podcasts. We're emailing each other like, a lot of the things are the same. The game's the same, but the playing field has changed in a lot of ways. So, and we see this in future generations too. Beat culture evolved into hippie culture, counterculture movements, all these things. And I found it very fascinating to see how many poets emerged because of the Beat generation, including Janine Pommy Vega in the 60s, Patti Smith, the musician, in the
Love
70s,
Patti
Hedwig
Smith.
Gorski, absolutely. And in 1982, Ginsberg even published a summary of the essential effects of the Beat generation, and they are, as included, spiritual liberation, sexual revolution or liberation, i.e., gay liberation, somewhat catalyzing women's liberation, Black liberation, Gray Panther activism, liberation of the world from censorship, demystification or decriminalization of cannabis and other drugs, the evolution of rhythm and blues into rock and roll as a high art form, as evidenced by the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, and other popular musicians influenced in the later 50s and 60s by Beat generation poets and writers' work, the spread of ecological consciousness, emphasized early by Gary Snyder and Michael McClure, the notion of a fresh planet, opposition to the military industrial complex, as emphasized in writings of Burroughs, Huncke, Ginsberg, and Kerouac, attention to what Kerouac called a second religiousness developing within advanced civilization.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that.
Return to an appreciation of idiosyncratic values and state versus state regimentation and respect for land and indigenous people and creatures, as proclaimed by Kerouac in his slogan from On the Road, "The earth is an Indian thing." So tell the good people, Miss Parsons, let's tie a bow on this bee and tell the good people why they need to study this particular part of art history.
Something we didn't give enough attention to, but I'll give into this is that poetry is definitely, especially this era, is a very much a spiritual awakening. It kind of it awakens something in you, and it speaks to the everyday psyche, things that you don't pay attention to. You're like that are poetic, as simple as like the past and how your father or mother, like in Kaddish, would walk down the streets to their old neighborhoods. Like those things are beautiful and poetic, and we don't romanticize that enough. We are nostalgic beings in nature, and poetry has a way of honoring that. But definitely, this generation had a way of honoring everything, like honoring the human psyche and people. And they really loved Buddhism, and they don't we forgot to touch base on that. I was going to bring that up before, and one reason why I'm a Buddhist, and I loved Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, even though like we talked about, like we talking about drugs and all of that stuff and how they got influenced in it. Ginsburg did believe that Buddhism and meditation was far superior. And through my experience, yes, it is. And it is, their poetry and their writings is very much a meditative form that I hope if you read will awaken something in you. And definitely if you don't have the what's the word I'm looking for, like the stamina to read their stuff, definitely YouTube and read and watch some of the documentaries, and that is very educating and enriching for your mind.
Well, there you have it, folks. The Beat Generation from top to bottom. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank my guest, Miss Alexandra Parsons, for joining us today. But before we go, we got a little extra for you, a little icing on the cake with what we call the Gym of the Week. It's something we like to talk about that doesn't always fit into the scheme of the episode. It may just be on our radar in the last day, week, or month, but we want to give it to you guys so you guys can dig deeper. Today's gems are brought to you by Zencastr. Zencastr is our go-to tool for remote podcast recordings. What's great is that you can record separate audio and video tracks, and it's all backed up on a secured cloud, so you never lose your hard work. Even better, it's easy to use, and there's nothing to download. So go to zen.ai, that's zen.ai/art of the beholder, or just use promo code Art of the Beholder and get 30% off your first 3 months with the pro account. Now back to the gems. Mine is kind of somewhat overlapping with this world. Most people that know me or just listen to me talk about the things I like on this show know that I love me some stand-up and some performance value and some all the above. And there is an HBO special by a man named John Early. His special is called Now More Than Ever. It is one part, it's all grounded in comedy. So it's the roots of it is just a stand-up comic set, but it also has moments like he has a band behind him, and there'll be times where he takes a break to play an entire song for the audience. And at first you think it's going to be this, comedic thing. He's doing covers of hits, and he is fucking nailing it. He is such a great singer and performer. I remember having this moment where my mouth kind of dropped of like, damn, this guy could have just been a singer. Like, he's that good. And then he'll go back into his comedic sets, and then there'll be breaks between those two things of recorded skits, like SNL style, where they already filmed a skit and then they edited it into the final cut of the show. And you get to then see his acting chops, his comedic acting chops with these skits. And it's a lot of things, but it comes together perfectly in the end. It's a great little special. Check it out, guys. John Early.
There's a book that I pick up on and off. The writer Pema Chodron. I'm probably mispronouncing it. I always mispronounce her last name. She's actually a Buddhist, and her books are they're very good for everyday people. It basically speaks in layman terms, because sometimes Buddhist books can be really heady and really technical, and it could kind of deter people away from reading some of it. But this one is called Welcoming the Unwelcomed, and it kind of helped me through a lot of my grief and understanding just the irrational things that happen in the world and kind of just accepting it. So I would recommend picking one of her books up.
How do the good people reach out to you if they ever want to connect?
AlexandraParsons.com is my portfolio website, or you can find me on Instagram and Alexandra_Parsons, or support some of my little goodies I make on Alexandra Parsons Co. On Etsy.
If you like that, you can always reach out to us at novodayproductions.com or follow @_Novo_day, and day is DE, and @NovoDayMedia. And then from there, guys, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, do all the things. If you want to be on the show, you can reach out to us at our email, novodaymedia@gmail.com. So until next time, we'll see you in the next one. So be good to each other. And as always, good luck and Godspeed. We love you.
Art of the Beholder is brought to you by Novo Day Productions. Created and hosted by Novo Day and the Novo Day Collective. Facebook.com/Novo Day Media, @Novo Day Media on Twitter and Instagram. Music by A Company. Facebook.com/ACO Music 123. ACO on Spotify. Logo design by Tom Justice, JESTUS, of thejusticecompany.com. And executively produced by Clayton Anderson. All rights reserved.